To many of us, pets are family. But in a divorce situation, the courts consider pets property. Hi, I'm Max Ruthenberg-Marshall, attorney and founder of Porchlight. Today we're going to be talking about how to reach a pet custody agreement with your spouse. As a pet owner myself, I own two Maine Coon cats, Lorna and Freya. I understand how important it is for some couples that both people continue to have a relationship with their pet after the divorce. The best way to do this is to reach an agreement with your spouse. If you go to court because the courts consider pets property, they are most likely to award ownership of the pet to one person only, as opposed to awarding continued shared ownership. By reaching an agreement with your spouse, which is technically a contract to continue jointly owning your pet, though it's called a pet custody agreement, you allow both parties to continue to have a relationship with the pet after the divorce. What does a pet custody agreement include? First, it identifies the pet, generally by name and type of animal. Then it lays out each party's rights and responsibilities towards the pet. So this includes financial responsibilities. It can include payment for everyday items such as food and any regular pet walking or boarding needs that the pet has. It can also include responsibility for major unexpected vet expenses. The agreement will lay out what ownership rights each party has of the pet. So it could be a fully, equally shared ownership situation where both parties have equal time with the pet. Or it could be a situation where one party has primary ownership of the pet and the other party has some limited rights that may be visitation rights or the right of first refusal to pet sit if the main owner goes out of town. If you also have children, you'll have a custody schedule for your children, and it is typical for the pet schedule to follow the children's schedule. So whoever has the children at any given moment will also have the pet. The agreement can also establish decision-making rules for if there is a major decision to be made for the pet. This usually comes into play if the pet is having health issues and there are major medical decisions that need to be made. What should you consider when reaching a pet custody agreement? You'll want to look at all the logistics of the situation. So how close are you and your ex-spouse going to be living to each other? If you're living really far apart, it may not make sense to frequently be exchanging the pet. You'll also want to look at your work schedules and consider if one party travels a lot for work and would be needing to board the pet during that time. And your work schedules generally, if one person works really long hours and the other person works from home and can give more care and attention to the pet, it might make sense for that person to have primary ownership. In addition to the logistics, you'll want to consider your pet's needs. So it may be really hard to admit, but your pet might have a preference for one spouse over the other. That might be your soon-to-be ex. It might also be you. But taking the pet's preference and bond with one human into account is a good thing to consider when deciding what the ultimate shared ownership arrangement is going to be. If the pet has significant medical needs that take a lot of time and attention, that's also something to factor into when deciding on how to share ownership. If one party is better able to meet those needs because of their schedule and the other demands that they do or don't have on their schedule, again, it might make sense to have primary ownership with that person. Even if you decide one person is going to have primary ownership, the other person can still have some ownership or visitation rights to the pet. So as I mentioned, it's best to reach an agreement to continue shared ownership of a pet because courts view pets as property and they're thinking of pets solely in terms of ownership and not in terms of custody and visitation. So if you can't agree and you have to go to court, what does that look like? First, the court has to decide whether the pet is separate or marital property. If it's separate property, the pet isn't subject to division in the divorce and it would be assigned to the person whose separate property is. So if one person owned the pet prior to the marriage, they could argue that that pet is their separate property. On the other hand, if their spouse contributed significantly to the pet's financial needs and care, they could argue that the pet has become commingled property and is at least partially marital property. If the court finds that the pet is marital property, the court gets to decide which party it is awarded to in the divorce. Most likely, the court will award sole ownership to one party without any ownership or visitation rights to the other party. The court's going to look at who has historically cared for the pet, who has spent the most time for the pet and given the most attention to the pet's needs, and whether there's been any negative treatment by either party towards the pet. The court's also going to look at how the parties are situated to care for the pet going forward. So the court may consider what kind of space you're in. If you are temporarily in housing that does not allow for pets because you just recently moved out of the marital home, the court is probably not going to rule that your spouse needs to hold on to the pet for 6 months and then completely give sole ownership up to you. The court's also going to look at who can best care for the pet going forward. That's both actually caring for the pet's needs, the physical needs, and making sure that they can cover the cost of the pet. If your post-divorce budget just does not allow for a pet, then the court may be more inclined to award the pet's ownership to your spouse. At Porchlight, we help couples reach agreements out of court, which is the absolute best way to reach a continued shared ownership or custody agreement for your pet. Give us a call to see how we can help you and your pet.